The greatest regret of a narcissist does not begin where most people think it does. It does not begin when you leave, when you stop responding, or when you finally understand who they are. It begins much later, at the exact moment they realize that hurting you did not bind you to them, but quietly removed something vital from their inner world. A narcissist believes pain is power. They believe that if someone continues to stay, continues to care, and continues to try after being hurt, that person must be weak, dependent, and ultimately controllable. When the empath absorbs the damage, forgives without being asked, and keeps offering understanding, the narcissist does not read this as strength. They read it as permission. Permission to go further, to push harder, to take more, and to cross lines without consequence. This is the fatal misjudgment, because the empath was never staying due to weakness. The empath was staying because they were holding something together, something the narcissist could not feel collapsing from the inside. And when that holding stops, the damage does not announce itself. There is no explosion, no confrontation, no dramatic ending. There is only absence. This is why the narcissist's regret does not arrive as guilt, remorse, or moral awakening. It arrives as disorientation, as a subtle but persistent sense that something essential is missing and cannot be named. In the language of depth psychology, especially in the work of Carl Jung, this is what happens when the shadow is no longer contained by another human psyche. When the mirror disappears, the mind is forced to turn inward, and what it encounters there is unstable, fragmented, and unbearable. The narcissist does not regret hurting you because they suddenly develop empathy. They regret it because the internal stability you once provided can no longer be outsourced. The structure they relied on begins to collapse, slowly, silently, and without language, and no amount of distraction, replacement, or performance can restore what was lost. This is not a story about revenge, closure, or visible suffering. It is about understanding why the moment you stop feeling, without anger, without hatred, and without emotional noise, became the most expensive psychological mistake the narcissist ever made. The narcissist's regret does not begin when the empath walks away, because departure is something the narcissist understands. People leave in anger. People leave in grief. People leave after confrontation. All of those exits still revolve around the narcissist's emotional gravity. They confirm significance. They validate impact. The true moment of regret begins somewhere far quieter, in a psychological space the narcissist was never trained to navigate. It begins when the empath is still physically present or recently present, still calm, still civil, but no longer emotionally responsive in any meaningful way. This moment carries no drama, no argument, no clear rupture, and precisely because of that, it destabilizes the narcissistic system at its core. A narcissist is oriented toward reaction. Their internal regulation depends on external feedback loops: admiration, conflict, reassurance, fear, longing. Emotional intensity of any kind keeps the system organized. When the empath stops reacting, those loops dissolve. There is no anger to manage, no sadness to exploit, no explanation to dismiss. The narcissist experiences this not as rejection, but as a sudden loss of orientation. Something that once anchored their inner world has quietly withdrawn, and there is no visible reason why. This absence is profoundly unsettling because it cannot be confronted or controlled. Initially, the narcissist misreads the situation. They assume the empath has finally adapted, finally numbed out, finally accepted the terms of the dynamic. This misinterpretation allows the empath's withdrawal to continue uninterrupted. The narcissist does not escalate immediately because there is nothing obvious to escalate against. There is no resistance to break, no pain to provoke, no emotional leverage to extract. What the narcissist does not realize is that what appears to be compliance is actually detachment at the deepest psychological level. As this detachment stabilizes, subtle symptoms begin to emerge inside the narcissist. Their sense of internal continuity weakens. They become restless without knowing why. Their moods fluctuate independently of external events. Control behaviors increase, not because of rage, but because of unease. The empath begins to occupy their thoughts not as an object of desire or resentment, but as an unresolved question. Something essential has changed, yet nothing concrete has been taken away. This contradiction generates a form of anxiety that has no narrative and no outlet. This is the point at which regret is born, though it is not recognized as regret. There is no self-blame, no acknowledgement of harm, no moral reckoning. What forms instead is a persistent internal disturbance. The narcissist feels destabilized without understanding the source. They may attribute this discomfort to boredom, stress, or dissatisfaction with others, but none of these explanations resolve the underlying tension. The problem is not situational, it is structural. From the perspective of depth psychology, particularly the work of Carl Jung, this moment marks a critical shift. When an individual unconsciously relies on another person to contain disowned emotional material, the removal of that container forces those elements back into the psyche. The empath had served this function silently, by remaining emotionally present without retaliation, without collapse, and without projection. They absorbed aspects of the narcissist's shadow that could not be consciously integrated. This was never acknowledged, but it was relied upon. When the empath stops performing this role, the narcissist does not feel loss in the relational sense. They feel exposure. Exposure is experienced as fragmentation. Thoughts lose coherence. Emotions surface without context. The narcissist may feel suddenly vulnerable, but without vulnerability leading to insight. Instead, it leads to defensive motion. They seek stimulation. They seek replacement. They seek intensity elsewhere. Yet nothing produces the same stabilizing effect because the function that was lost was not interchangeable. It was not affection, attention, or admiration. It was psychic containment. As this realization remains unconscious, regret takes on its most corrosive form. It becomes chronic rather than acute. The narcissist senses that something was damaged through their own actions, but cannot articulate what it was or how it happened. This produces a looping internal state, searching without clarity, acting without resolution, repeating patterns without relief. The empath becomes symbolically central in this loop, not as a person to be reunited with, but as the last point at which the narcissist felt internally coherent. What makes this regret irreversible is timing. By the moment the narcissist begins to sense the magnitude of what was lost, the empath is already psychologically absent, not distant, not angry, simply unreachable. The empath's emotional withdrawal has crossed a threshold beyond which reconnection would require the narcissist to confront their own shadow directly. And that confrontation is precisely what the narcissistic structure was designed to avoid. The narcissist does not regret hurting the empath because of empathy or conscience. They regret it because the pain they inflicted terminated the only dynamic that buffered them from their own inner chaos. The empath's withdrawal did not punish the narcissist. It revealed them to themselves without mediation. And that revelation, stripped of narrative and meaning, becomes the defining psychological cost. From this moment forward, the narcissist may continue functioning, forming relationships, and performing competence. But something essential has shifted. Their inner world no longer feels held. The regret does not fade, because it was never about the past. It is embedded in the present as a constant background instability. And that is why this moment, the quiet, unremarkable moment when the empath stopped feeling, becomes the true origin of the narcissist's greatest regret. Once the narcissist's regret has formed, it does not evolve into insight, it does not mature into accountability, and it does not soften into empathy. Instead, it hardens into a psychological condition, one that follows them forward, shaping their behavior without ever transforming it. This is because the regret was never moral in nature. It was structural. And structures do not heal through remorse. At this stage, the narcissist begins to behave in ways that appear contradictory. They may speak nostalgically about the empath, recalling moments of closeness with an almost reverent tone. They may idealize the past, selectively rewriting history to portray the empath as the one who understood them. At the same time, they remain incapable of genuine repair. Apologies, if they appear at all, are hollow, indirect, or strategic. What they seek is not forgiveness, but relief from the internal pressure that has begun to build. This is where many people misinterpret what they are seeing. From the outside, the narcissist's behavior can resemble regret. They look back, they reach out, they seem unsettled. But what drives these actions is not awareness of harm. It is the need to restore internal regulation. The empath is remembered not as a person who was loved, but as a psychological environment that no longer exists. According to the depth psychology framework articulated by Carl Jung, when the shadow is not consciously integrated, it does not disappear. It seeks expression through compulsion. In the narcissist's case, the empath once served as an unconscious container for these disowned elements. With that container gone, the shadow presses inward, demanding resolution without offering language. The narcissist feels driven, agitated, and unsettled, but cannot locate the source of the disturbance within themselves. This is why the regret never leads to growth. Growth would require the narcissist to tolerate self-examination without external stabilization. It would require them to sit with shame, limitation, and vulnerability without deflecting or projecting. But the narcissistic structure is organized precisely to prevent this. Instead of integration, the narcissist resorts to repetition. They replay dynamics with new people, hoping to recreate the same sense of internal coherence they once had with the empath. These repetitions always fail, and the failure deepens the regret. New relationships may provide stimulation, admiration, or novelty, but they do not recreate the specific psychic function the empath provided. Over time, the narcissist becomes increasingly aware that something unique was lost, yet remains unable to articulate what that something was. This gap between felt loss and conceptual understanding becomes a source of quiet torment. The regret therefore becomes cyclical. It resurfaces during moments of stillness, when distractions fade and the inner instability becomes harder to ignore. It appears as restlessness, irritability, or an undefined dissatisfaction with life. The narcissist may blame circumstances, partners, or external stressors, but none of these explanations resolve the underlying tension. The regret persists because it is attached to an absence that cannot be filled. Crucially, this form of regret does not motivate reconciliation in any meaningful sense. Even if the narcissist attempts to reconnect with the empath, the motivation is restorative rather than relational. They seek to re-establish the old function, not to acknowledge the harm that destroyed it. And because the empath's withdrawal was psychological rather than situational, this restoration is impossible. The empath is no longer available as a container, even if contact were to resume. As time passes, the narcissist's regret settles into the background of their personality. It becomes part of their baseline experience, an unspoken sense of loss that informs their behavior without ever being confronted. They may become more controlling, more performative, or more emotionally detached, all in an effort to compensate for the internal instability that now defines them. The regret does not fade, it fossilizes. What makes this regret particularly corrosive is that it offers no redemption arc. There is no moment of clarity in which the narcissist recognizes their role and changes course. There is no cathartic breakdown followed by healing. Instead, the narcissist continues forward with a diminished capacity for genuine connection, haunted not by what they did, but by what they lost access to through their own actions. In this sense, the regret becomes self-perpetuating. The very defenses that created the loss now prevent its resolution. The narcissist cannot return to the moment before the empath's withdrawal, because doing so would require dismantling the structure that made the withdrawal inevitable. And so the regret remains silent, unresolved, and woven into the fabric of their psychological life. This is the final cruelty of the dynamic. The empath does not need to witness the regret. They do not need acknowledgement, apology, or validation. The consequence has already occurred at a level beyond visibility. The narcissist's greatest regret is not that they hurt someone who loved them. It is that by doing so, they eliminated the one relationship that shielded them from themselves, and that loss can never be undone. The narcissist's regret cannot be repaired because it was never caused by a single event. It was caused by the collapse of a function. And once a psychological function is lost at the structural level, it cannot be restored through effort, apology, or substitution. What broke was not the relationship. What broke was the internal mechanism that allowed the narcissist to remain coherent without facing themselves. The empath was not interchangeable. This is the central misunderstanding that keeps the narcissist trapped in repetition. They assume that what was lost can be replaced by finding someone new who is attentive, understanding, or emotionally available. But the empath did not provide a set of behaviors. They provided containment. Over time, they absorbed emotional volatility, unresolved shame, and disowned vulnerability without retaliating or collapsing. This created a stable psychic environment the narcissist came to rely on unconsciously. When that environment disappeared, the narcissist lost more than a person. They lost a stabilizing structure. From the perspective of depth psychology, particularly in the work of Carl Jung, integration cannot occur without conscious engagement with the shadow. The narcissistic structure avoids this engagement by externalizing internal conflict. As long as the empath was present, this externalization worked. The empath held what the narcissist could not, But once the empath withdrew, the strategy failed. The shadow returned inward without mediation, and the narcissist lacked the capacity to meet it. This is why attempts at repair always collapse. Even if the narcissist becomes aware that something precious was lost, awareness alone does not equal integration. To truly repair what was broken would require sustained self-reflection, tolerance of shame, and acceptance of limitation. These are precisely the experiences the narcissistic structure is organized to avoid. Repair would demand dismantling the very defenses that once made the relationship possible, and that demand is experienced not as healing, but as annihilation. Substitutes fail for the same reason. New relationships may temporarily soothe the surface, but they do not address the core deficit. Without the empath's unique capacity for containment, every new bond remains shallow or volatile. Over time, the narcissist becomes increasingly aware that something fundamental is missing, yet remains incapable of recreating it. This awareness sharpens the regret without offering a path forward. The irreversibility of the regret is also shaped by timing. By the time the narcissist recognizes the depth of the loss, the empath has already reorganized their inner world. Emotional withdrawal is not a pause, it is a reconfiguration. The empath no longer occupies the psychological position required to resume the old function. Even if contact were re-established, the dynamic that once existed cannot be revived. The structure that supported it no longer exists on either side. What remains, then, is a form of regret that cannot be acted upon. It cannot be resolved through reconciliation, because reconciliation would require a version of the empath that no longer exists. It cannot be resolved through self-improvement, because genuine improvement would require confronting the shadow directly. And it cannot be resolved through denial, because the internal instability persists regardless of external success. The narcissist may continue to function socially, professionally, and romantically. From the outside, life appears intact, but internally, the loss has created a permanent deficit. The sense of being held, mirrored, and emotionally regulated without exposure is gone. This absence becomes the background condition of their inner life. It informs decisions, relationships, and behaviors without ever being acknowledged. This is why the regret does not fade with time. It is not tied to memory or nostalgia. It is embedded in the present as a continuous lack of coherence. The narcissist is haunted not by what they did, but by what they can no longer access. And because that access depended on a structure they themselves destroyed, the regret becomes a closed system. In the end, the narcissist's greatest regret cannot be fixed, because fixing it would require becoming someone they are structurally unable to be. The loss stands as a silent consequence, not meant to teach, punish, or redeem, but to persist. And it is this persistence, quiet, unacknowledged, and irreversible, that defines the true cost of hurting the empath. The final loss the narcissist suffers is not the empath themselves. It is the loss of a psychological position that can never be occupied again. The empath was not simply someone who loved, tolerated, or understood. They were the only relational space in which the narcissist could exist without constant self-fragmentation. When that space collapses, it does not reopen. It cannot be recreated through effort, charm, or time. It is gone because the conditions that allowed it to exist have been destroyed. What the narcissist loses forever is the experience of being seen without being exposed. The empath held complexity without weaponizing it. They recognized contradiction without demanding confession. They allowed the narcissist to feel momentarily whole without requiring integration. This was never conscious on either side, but it was essential. Once it ends, the narcissist can no longer inhabit that state again. Every future connection demands performance, control, or concealment. There is no longer a place to rest psychologically. This loss is irreversible because it is not relational. It is existential. The empath's withdrawal removes the last buffer between the narcissist and their own shadow. As described in the work of Carl Jung, the shadow does not vanish when ignored. It accumulates pressure. Without a relational container to hold it, the narcissist must either integrate it or defend against it constantly. Integration is structurally intolerable. Defense becomes permanent. From this point forward, the narcissist's life is organized around avoidance. Avoidance of depth, avoidance of stillness, avoidance of any intimacy that might threaten exposure. Relationships become transactional or theatrical. Emotional exchanges are managed rather than lived. The narcissist may appear functional, charismatic, even successful, but the internal cost is severe. There is no longer a place where the self can loosen without risk. What is lost forever is not love, but grounding. The empath provided a sense of internal gravity, a feeling that the narcissist's inner chaos had somewhere to land. Without that gravity, the narcissist drifts. They move from connection to connection without settling, from role to role without coherence. This drift is not dramatic. It is subtle, persistent, and exhausting. The tragedy is that the narcissist often recognizes this loss only indirectly. They feel emptier after encounters that once energized them. They feel more restless in relationships that appear perfect on the surface. They sense that something essential is missing, but they cannot locate it in the present. And because the loss is not tied to a single memory or event, it cannot be mourned. It becomes a silent absence rather than a conscious grief. This is why no future relationship can replicate what was lost. Even if another empath appears, the conditions are no longer the same. The narcissist's defenses have hardened. Their capacity for unconscious reliance has been compromised. The innocence of the original dynamic is gone. What remains is a closed system, operating on repetition rather than renewal. The final loss, then, is the loss of psychological refuge. The one place where the narcissist did not need to maintain constant vigilance has vanished. And because the narcissist cannot acknowledge the true nature of that refuge without confronting their own dependency and limitation, the loss remains unnamed. It follows them as a background condition, shaping every bond without ever being addressed. In the end, what the narcissist loses forever is the possibility of being held without control. The empath's presence once allowed that illusion. Their withdrawal ends it, not as punishment, not as revenge, but as consequence. And that consequence does not fade. It defines the remainder of the narcissist's relational life, not loudly, not visibly, but absolutely. The final consequence of hurting an empath is not punishment. It is not karma in the dramatic sense, and it is not suffering that can be observed, measured, or corrected. It is a permanent internal condition, a narrowing of psychological possibility that the narcissist carries forward for the rest of their life. What was lost cannot be reclaimed, not because the empath refuses to return, but because the structure that allowed that bond to exist has collapsed. The empath's withdrawal does not teach the narcissist a lesson. Lessons require reflection, and reflection requires a self that can tolerate truth without disintegrating. What occurs instead is something colder and more final. The narcissist continues to live, to function, to relate, but always from behind reinforced defenses. The part of them that once relied silently, unconsciously, on another human psyche to hold what they could not is gone, and with it goes the last opportunity for unguarded connection. From the lens of depth psychology, especially as articulated by Carl Jung, this is the cost of refusing integration. The shadow does not disappear when avoided. It exacts payment in limitation. The narcissist's world becomes smaller, flatter, more controlled. Relationships lose depth. Intimacy becomes risky. Stillness becomes threatening. What remains is motion without rest, performance without grounding, connection without safety. This is why the empath does not need to be vindicated. There is nothing to prove and no score to settle. The consequence has already occurred at the level that matters most. The narcissist's regret is not a story they tell themselves. It is the absence they live inside. It does not scream. It hums. It follows them quietly into every future bond, shaping outcomes without explanation. And the empath's role in this ending is not aggressive, righteous, or strategic. It is simply the act of withdrawing emotional investment. No confrontation was required. No cruelty was necessary. By becoming still, by no longer reacting, by refusing to carry what was never theirs to carry, the empath ended a dynamic that could not survive without their presence. What collapsed did so under its own weight. In the end, the narcissist does not lose you. They lose the only place where they could exist without constant defense. They lose the illusion of being held without accountability. And they lose it forever, not because you took something away, but because you stopped supplying what should never have been asked of you in the first place. That is the final consequence. Silent, irreversible, complete.